first talk I'm going to give you is about knowledge translation, and particularly social media. Now, why is a neurologist standing here talking to you about social media? That's a very good question. I started my life dealing with big tobacco, as in countering the effects of advertising. So I got very interested in the whole advertising and marketing area. As well as our concussion research, we have a group that specialises in researching social media. And we've had a number of PhDs from this group and looked at the whole range of social media and the role of educating people in concussion and other medical areas. And it is a fascinating issue. If you worked out the answer to the question yet, this is the beauty of social media. We as doctors are so used to delivering information, writing guidelines, and you've heard some excellent talks about some of the guidelines this morning. But patients use social media not to look for medical information necessarily. They use it to look for peer support. They try to get information from other people who suffer with the problem. So it's not a vehicle that necessarily we would think of as, oh, we just put the guidelines on there and they'll understand it. It's not the way it works. It's a very different world. But it's potentially an important world because if you want to reach people, if you want to make guidelines effective, this is the way to do it. Now, just some basics first of all. What is social media? Some of you, hopefully all of you, will be familiar with it. It's web and mobile technologies. It's interactive communication. So it's very different to reading a medical journal or attending a lecture where somebody's didactically giving you information. Most of you will have heard of Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, but when you get into the whole world of social media, and you only have to ask your children and teenagers about it, there are thousands upon thousands of social media sites. And they all have different roles. They all have different markets. Some are specific to geographic areas, specific to certain languages. Some relate to business. There are social medias about photographs and spreading videos around the world and so forth. So it's not a simple thing about just putting a post on Facebook and your message will get out there. As I said, they have different roles, the social media, and people use them in different ways. So this is a humorous slide, but it kind of illustrates just how people use the different sites in different ways. So Twitter, for example, you've got 140 characters that you can write something, so you just tell very short, precise bits of information. Facebook, you brag about it. Things like Flickr and Instagram and things like that, you take photographs of what you do and share that information. So and the Brazilian one, of course, is Orkut, which is you have a party afterwards. So what's wrong with us as doctors? Why aren't the guidelines working? Well, if you go back to knowledge translation theory, and probably the best person in the world who's worked on this is a guy called Paul Glasziou, who works for the British Medical Journal and is now based in England. He talks about the research to practice pipeline, going from the guidelines or the information at the start, and the end users firstly have to be aware of it, they have to accept or engage with the information provided, they have to agree with it, they have to act on it, and ultimately use it. And at each step along that way, there's a leakage of that process. Now, if you go through that process and just take, for example, an 80% uptake at each level, the end result is only 20% of people actually use the guidelines out there. And that's pretty much where we are with most medical guidelines. The average end user uptake is in the order of 20 to 30%, which is disappointing for all the work we put in writing guidelines year after year after year. So getting the message out, getting the people aware of the guidelines is the first step. Now, Jerzy talked about the consensus conference. We've had 4 meetings over a decade or so. The European Federation of Neurology has had a number of meetings about guidelines in head injury. Well, just to pick up with that video we saw of the goalkeeper before, the knowledge of concussion guidelines amongst the English FA club doctors was surveyed last year, and a third of the doctors weren't aware of the guidelines. So even though the FA has them written down and they're all very clear, they're simply not aware of them. 50% were aware of the guidelines, but they didn't actually follow them. And of those, 30% were actually using rugby guidelines. You know, how does this happen? These are all doctors, they're trained professionals. yet they seem to not engage with, not understand, not be aware of that process. But it's not just doctors, because when you survey coaches, parents, trainers, physiotherapists, athletes, they're in the same boat. The guidelines are very poorly accepted and used at the end of the road, the end user situation. So we have a problem with guidelines, and this is where knowledge translation theory becomes very important, because we look at the barriers and we look at the ways of getting around those barriers to make them more effective. So why use social media? What's the attraction? Well, it should be clear. Almost a half of the world population is on some sort of social media forum. Of the people who use Twitter, for example, or Facebook, the majority of those are accessing their accounts on a daily basis, sometimes many times a day. So if you can get a message out there that is what we call sticky in advertising terms, then you can get that message to the end user very quickly. And if you're using Twitter and those sort of organisations, the average person with a Twitter account has 80 people that he can retweet to. So very quickly that tree of knowledge can get out into the broader community around the world, across cultures, across languages, almost instantaneously. As you can see there, Facebook has 1.15 million people on it, which is an extraordinary number given that it didn't exist 15 years ago. And that's why their share price is so high. Now, an example of that, if we go outside the sporting context now, outside the medical context, is this Facebook post that was from a couple of years now, Khaled Said. This was the reason the Libyan government fell. This post was put up about a tragic circumstance of a Libyan who was killed by the security forces. And it created so much interest and so much knowledge amongst the population of the country that it really created the start of the revolution which led to the fall of Gaddafi. So this is a Facebook post changing governments. You know, just imagine if we could do that with a concussion post and get people to do the right thing. Now, those of you who are in the academic world and like publishing will realise the thing that determines whether you get grants and things is how many times you get cited. We did an exercise when we did the consensus statement last year where we actually posted information on Facebook and tweeted through the network that belongs to the British Journal of Sports Medicine a number of key people. And if you can imagine that each of those people can retweet 80 times, it's 275 to the power of 80 potential recipients of this information. It's a very, very big number. But the end result of just doing that amount of social media posting resulted in the first week after the article came out, 320,000 visits online, 40,000 downloads, and it was the fastest accessed paper in the British Medical Journal's history. It's an extraordinary thing. So if you're publishing and you want your article to be cited, this is a way to do it. So you can use it in all sorts of different ways. But again, we thought it was very important not just to make this freely and copyright-free accessible to people, which we have done all the way through, but to try and get that information out. And this was a test. So with the group I mentioned, we've been through all the various social media sites to see the different effects of things. Facebook I'll come back to in a moment in terms of interventional studies. Twitter is probably the most powerful tool for getting the information out to the largest number in the shortest period of time. And because it's only a short message, you have to be very precise about your information, but it can raise awareness almost instantaneously. So Twitter is probably the most powerful tool in terms of this process. We've also looked at iPhone and Android apps that are available through the iTunes store. We've looked at the information online and the quality of that information, and it's enormously variable. Don't think it's all good quality medical stuff. There's all sorts of crazy people out there. YouTube, similarly, has a huge number of concussion videos and examples of things. So again, the idea of people wanting to see things is part of the process. But more than just trying to get the information out there, what we tried to do was actually do an intervention study where we put up a page with quality medical information and moderated it, and then tracked how that information went through the internet. There are ways and means of doing this. And we found that, again, as I said at the start, the individuals weren't so much interested in the guidelines themselves, they were interested in the peer experience of the injury. So having other people being able to share information was really, really important in that process. And it's amazing how quickly that information can get out through the internet using this sort of approach. So it is a powerful tool. It's an underused tool in medicine so far. And there's been a few groups in different aspects of medicine, cancer research and so forth, who are starting to get into this as a way of delivering knowledge to the community. The problem with Facebook is if you type in concussion and go to how many groups out there, or post-concussive syndrome, there are over 1,000 groups. So this just becomes one voice in a multitude of information out there. So how you get people's information, how you grab their attention, comes back to basic marketing and advertising principles of a sticky idea that can work. So knowing how to do it is really important, because the information out there is not always correct, and by trying to improve it, we hopefully will deal with better information down the track. The quick and dirty approach, if you don't want to go through an intervention process, is do this. Facebook, for example, has advertising, and you can buy advertising space on somebody's web page, somebody's Facebook page, and the beauty of that is you can target it for any demographic, any sex, any geographic place in the world. So you can actually very, very accurately target that information. If you want to have 21 to 24-year-old men who play football, you can do that. If you want to have 65-year-olds who enjoy parachute jumping, you can pick that target demographic just as easily. So again, that makes a very interesting option in terms of being able to deliver that information. So the two messages I can give you is that it's really important, and now there's some theory behind the idea of using social media, but the take-home message is that if you want to engage social media, it's not about medical knowledge, it's about peer support. We as doctors don't really get that approach around the world. It's about sharing information and being interactive at that level. Just putting up guidelines and hoping that the social media will pick it up is wasted effort. So with that, I'm going to finish this talk. Thank you.